Let's continue with the issues in science journalism. This is part one because next week you're going to see the issues in science journalism in a different point of view. So first, we are looking at the qualification of the science journalist. The question that usually scientists have is whether or not the science journalist should have a degree in science. Obviously, the reason why such question appear or raised up because as we have discussed before, the jargons in science and the complicated information in science are rather could not be deciphered by people with no background of science. Therefore, if a science journalist want to disseminate the information that they receive from the journalist to the public, they first must have background in the science itself. In order for them to be able to translate the complex information that the scientists supply to them or provided to them. Some of the scientists usually argue that you will see it later in the video by Neil deGrasse. He said that most of the information that written by the journalist, even though the journalist interviewed him, usually there will be mistakes in it. So the question of whether the scientist should have a degree in science is rather prevalent among scientists themselves. They even sometimes ask journalists to send back whatever the journalists have written on the interview or the information that the scientists have provided to them to the scientists back so the scientists can have a look before the articles being published to the mass consumption. However, this practice is quite impractical to the scientists. If you remember all this mass media limitation, they have a tight deadline. Even though, for example, if the editor doesn't want them to publish the articles that they have written, that has been checked by the scientists and they have written on it, so it's kind of a waste of time, isn't it? So in short, when a global survey has been conducted among science journalists, they found that having a science degree is not as important as being a well-trained and reports the facts independently, neutrally, and in original manner. So the key point is here being well-trained, able to report the facts, work as independent, you don't have bias, and then you are neutral when you are reporting the science stories, as well as it is in original manner, which means it is in the right context as the context that being provided by the scientists. So the survey said so. In a way, it's not as important as being whatever this is, being this character rather than having a degree of science. So another issues of science journalism is that the ethos main character that is used to describe the guiding beliefs or ideals that characterize a community, nation, or ideology. So in this sense, it's about science journalism or science journalists. So the ethos of a science journalist is that their task is basically to inform, to translate complex material, and to educate. So based on my study, when I interviewed all these journalists, they usually have this ideal role of being a disseminator, of an agent of raising awareness. So they don't see themselves as working on a propaganda. They simply really have a noble intention in their jobs. However, with this kind of ethos, which is to inform, to translate complex material, and to educate, people have been asking whether such character or such roles are not critical enough. There is this convention of science transmission, which is a convention means something that is being practiced by the whole science journalists. So in science transmission, transmitting the science information from the scientific community to the public by the science journalists. This is practice that what they have done. They usually work, like I said, they are the disseminator of the information. There is, they basically have no say in questioning the information. They are rather really not independent. They are basically just parroting whatever they were given, and they write it down in their articles and they publish it. So there's no scrutiny involved, and as well as since they don't question it, usually because they see science as a sacred values. You know how people don't usually question religious teaching because they see it as a sacred values. We're going to have that discussion in some other time if we have. Usually we don't. But anyway, so when you see something that is a sacred, you don't usually question it. You usually just take it as it is. So this is the convention of science transmission. This is what scientists usually been doing in science journalism. However, there is another form of journalism which is called investigative journalism. In this type of journalism, the ideal of the journalist's job is actually as a watchdog. What is watchdog? Basically, you guard people against the powerful and ensure justice is done. So in order for you to do this, you must have a high, whatever you report, you will question it whether this is right, this is wrong, whether it has a value in it, whether you will scrutinize the information that you get. So that's basically it. You are very investigative in your journalism. The question is now, where does actually science journalist falls into? Because previously we discussed that the ethos is to describe, to disseminate information, to translate knowledge, and also to educate. But that somehow is not as much as being critical in the investigative journalism. So the problem with just being just the convention of science transmission, it somehow results in it may cause some scientific problems or in the science practice being not covered. So if you remember in your introduction to science and technology studies, you have studied the Mertonian norms. So if the journalists know these Mertonian norms and they question whether the scientists practice the Mertonian norms, then they can actually somehow do the investigative journalism. Talking about the uncovered scandals due to the convention of the science transmission, and rather than doing investigative journalism, there is a scandal somehow occurred in South Korea, I think in the 2000s, and this scandal actually involved the Korean press. So for this week tutorial, I would like you guys to have a look and have a read on the Hwang scandal and how does the investigative Korean press practice have actually discovered this scandal. So you will read it and will write down what you think about it and some summary and description of this scandal on this week tutorial. So that's something for you to look for. Sorry. So the next question will be, can the journalist produce independent, accurate, and critical report on science? We ask scientists to be investigative so that none of the malpractice in science will be left uncovered. So, however, so that's why we have the Hwang scandal discovered. However, just so you know that independent, accurate, and critical reporting is actually expensive. It costs in time, money, and human resources. And if you still remember, the mass media limitation is that journalists work in a very tight deadline. Previously, they just have a deadline of 24 hours, but these days, because of the online news, so the deadline is like whenever they have a news, they have to report it immediately. So time is at cost, and money as well. In order for you to do investigative journalism, you need to have support, you need to get money, you need to also get support from the authority. And if it involves authority, that's another question. And also human resources. Not many can do such investigative journalism. So the question whether journalists can produce independent, accurate, critical report on science, they can't, but there are costs for it. So another issue in the science journalism is that sources of scientific information. So if you look at this table, this is one of the survey that's conducted on the science journalists, looking at the sources that they look for to get story ideas. So if you really look at this, most of the story ideas or the sources that they usually refer to is personal context. So when you talk about personal context, it means that they usually have established a contact with scientists or experts. So if it's a novice journalist, they will probably have a problems in getting personal context, to get the sources of information. Also, you see conference, so and press release, press officer, other media outlets, blog, and other science journal are the main story sources. But then if you look at down towards the below of these sources, they are actually more reliable sources. For example, the Nature, the Science, the Exhibition, the Science Media Center, they rarely look at these sources to get their story ideas. So when they have so the problem is, first, they have many sources, so for them to choose which of the stories that has priority to be published or to be featured, they need to do the decision. And prior to that, they also need to have background in translating the complicated stories of the science findings of science research. So basically, science journalists science journalists deal with many sources of information, and that's why at the end of the day, they go with the easy way, which is the personal context, the one that they have trust, they have built trust in it, they have built rapport with them, and then you know how these people work, and they just use whatever information that they get from the expert. So and sometimes this can lead to biasness. Talking about the biasness, some of the way that the science journalism have found to avoid biasness is by having several charitable foundation to sponsor journalists to provide truly independent news. Remember when I said that to get independent critical news is actually expensive in time, expensive in money, expensive in resources. So that's why they have some charitable foundations that sponsor journalists to do all the investigative job. And so when they are not under influence of certain organization, but rather a charitable foundation, they can work independently. So they call this as Reporters Without Orders. This is seen as a way of bridging the crisis of journalism and securing its social mission to provide independent news information under adverse conditions. These are initiatives supported by charitable foundations, so far mainly in US and the UK, that support a truly independent investigative style of journalism. So next question is, so what actually happened in Malaysian journalism? Science journalism. We have been discussing about science journalism in Malaysia, in the US, the history. You know what are the historical or the popular science magazine that have a long history, such as the Popular Science and American Scientific Magazine. Next, in the tutorial, you have to search on what are there out there or that's happening in science journalism in Malaysia. So you will be answering questions on the tutorial. Alright, so I think so I will show you what you need to do next. So other than answering the question on the Huang scandal, as well as looking at what are there out there in the science journalism in Malaysia, you would also need to find more issues in science journalism by watching the next two videos and answer the tutorial questions. So answer your tutorial here, and as usual, you can always ask me for any question. And then I think that's all from me for this week. Thank you.